March 15, 1942, 14:30 hours. Kitchen, Patterson Residence, Springfield, Illinois. Dorothy Patterson stood over her pressure cooker watching the gauge climb to 15 pounds while green beans bubbled inside sealed mason jars. Outside, the March wind rattled the kitchen window. On the counter, the radio carried grim news from the Pacific. American forces retreating across the Philippines, supply lines collapsing, soldiers starving because food couldn't reach them before spoiling. Dorothy had been preserving food since she was 12 years old, learning techniques from her mother who'd learned from her mother before that. The process was simple. Pack food into jars, seal them, apply heat and pressure to kill bacteria, let them cool to create vacuum seal. The preserved food would last months or years without refrigeration, protected by the vacuum seal that prevented bacterial growth. She'd been thinking about the radio reports for days. Food spoilage, troops going hungry, the quartermaster explaining that fresh food spoiled within days, that refrigeration was impossible in combat zones, that tin cans were in short supply because tin was needed for other war materials. The problem seemed obvious. The Army needed food preservation that didn't require refrigeration or scarce materials. Dorothy finished sealing her green beans, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat down at the kitchen table with pen and paper. She wrote a letter to the War Department explaining her preservation method, describing how vacuum sealing in glass jars kept food fresh indefinitely without refrigeration, noting that the materials were common and the process was simple enough that any factory could adapt it. Her husband Tom came home from his shift at the rail yard and found her addressing the envelope to U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, Washington, D.C. "What are you doing, Dot?" he asked, reading over her shoulder. "Trying to help," she said. "They're talking about soldiers starving because food spoils before it reaches them. I know how to keep food from spoiling. Seemed like I should tell them." Tom looked at his wife, a housewife from Springfield, Illinois, writing to the War Department with advice about feeding armies, and didn't have the heart to tell her they'd never read it. "That's real thoughtful, honey," he said, and helped her find a stamp. 3 months later, Dorothy Patterson received a letter from the Quartermaster Food and Container Institute asking if she'd be willing to consult on food preservation techniques for military applications. Her kitchen trick was about to become the foundation for feeding the largest military force America had ever deployed overseas. The logistical nightmare. By early 1942, American military planners faced food supply crisis that threatened to limit the scale and scope of overseas operations. The problem wasn't producing food. American agriculture could feed armies many times larger than what was being fielded. The problem was getting food from American farms to soldiers fighting thousands of miles away and keeping it edible during the journey. The statistics documented catastrophic waste. In 1942, the U.S. military was shipping approximately 400,000 tons of food monthly to overseas forces. Of that total, approximately 30–40% spoiled before reaching troops, roughly 120,000–160,000 tons monthly of wasted food that had to be destroyed rather than consumed. Fresh vegetables and fruits spoiled within days, unless refrigerated, which was impossible in most combat zones. Fresh meat spoiled within hours in tropical heat. Bread developed mold within a week. Even preserved foods in traditional containers deteriorated faster than anticipated when exposed to heat, humidity, salt air, and rough handling during transport. The spoilage represented more than wasted food. It represented wasted shipping capacity, wasted resources, and troops who went hungry despite being part of the best-supplied military in history. Cargo ships that could carry limited tonnage were using precious capacity to transport food that would be thrown away. The inefficiency was intolerable when shipping was the bottleneck limiting how many troops could be supported overseas. The existing solutions weren't adequate. Canned food in tin containers worked reasonably well, but required tin that was increasingly scarce, as war production consumed available supplies. Dehydrated foods reduced weight, but required substantial water for reconstitution, which wasn't always available in combat zones. Preserved foods like salted meat were durable but monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Fresh foods were ideal, but spoiled too quickly for overseas transport. The search for solutions. The Quartermaster Food and Container Institute in Chicago had been working on food preservation problems since before American entry into the war. The facility employed food scientists, chemists, nutritionists, and engineers who were tasked with developing field rations that could survive transport and storage without refrigeration, while providing adequate nutrition and being palatable enough that soldiers would actually eat them. The Institute received thousands of suggestions from civilians who thought they had solutions to military food problems. Most suggestions were impractical, poorly thought out, or based on misunderstanding of the challenges involved. The staff had learned to quickly assess submissions and discard those that wouldn't work. Dorothy Patterson's letter was different. Dr. Robert Chen, a food scientist at the Institute, read her description of vacuum sealing in glass containers and recognized immediately that she'd identified a key principle that military food preservation needed: creating anaerobic environment that prevented bacterial growth without requiring scarce materials or constant refrigeration. The Institute had been experimenting with various vacuum sealing approaches, but had focused on metal containers that required tin. Patterson's method used glass jars that were readily available from commercial manufacturers. Glass wasn't ideal for military use. It was fragile, heavy, and bulky. But the principle of creating vacuum seals could potentially be adapted to other containers if the basic technique could be refined for military application. Chen called Patterson and asked detailed questions about her preservation process. How long did preserved foods last? What types of foods could be preserved? What equipment was necessary? How reliable were the seals? Could the process be scaled for industrial production? Patterson answered from 30 years of practical experience. She'd preserved everything from vegetables to fruits to meat. Foods lasted years if properly sealed. The equipment was simple: pressure cookers, jars, lids, and heat. Seals were extremely reliable if process was followed correctly. And yes, commercial canneries already used similar processes at industrial scale. She was just describing home adaptation of established techniques, from kitchen to laboratory. Within weeks of the initial contact, Dorothy Patterson was consulting regularly with Institute scientists who were adapting her home preservation methods for military applications. She traveled to Chicago and demonstrated her techniques in Institute laboratories, showing researchers exactly how she created vacuum seals, maintained sterile conditions, and tested seal integrity. The scientists were impressed by the sophistication of Patterson's practical knowledge. She understood microbiology intuitively without formal training. She knew that bacteria needed air, moisture, and moderate temperatures to grow, and that removing any of those factors prevented spoilage. She understood heat transfer and pressure relationships in ways that aligned perfectly with scientific principles, even though she described them in housewife terms rather than technical language. The challenge was adapting techniques that worked in home kitchens to industrial production that could produce millions of rations. Glass jars wouldn't work for military use, but the vacuum sealing principle could be applied to other containers. The Institute began experimenting with layered containers using waxed paperboard, metal foils, and synthetic materials that could create vacuum seals without requiring scarce tin or fragile glass. The breakthrough came from combining Patterson's vacuum sealing principles with emerging materials technology. By using aluminum foil bonded to paperboard and sealed with wax coatings, Containers could be created that were lightweight, durable, resistant to moisture and oxygen penetration, and capable of maintaining vacuum seals for extended periods. The containers could be mass-produced using materials that weren't rationed for military production. The C-ration revolution. The C-ration, officially the Type C field ration, became the primary application of Patterson's preservation principles adapted for military use. The C-ration consisted of 3 pre-cooked meals packaged in vacuum-sealed containers that could survive extended storage and transport without refrigeration. The packaging revolution made C-rations possible. Each meal component was sealed in individual containers using vacuum sealing techniques derived from Patterson's methods. Meat units contained pre-cooked beef, pork, or chicken in gravy or sauce. Bread units included crackers or compressed biscuits. Accessory packs contained coffee, sugar, candy, cigarettes, and other items. The entire meal was packaged in outer containers that protected against moisture, oxygen, and physical damage. The preservation effectiveness exceeded anything previous military rations had achieved. Traditional canned rations spoiled at approximately 15 to 20% rates during extended storage and transport. C-rations using vacuum-sealed packaging showed spoilage rates of approximately 3 to 5%, a reduction of roughly 80% that dramatically improved food availability and reduced waste. The nutritional content was carefully calculated to provide approximately 3,000 calories daily when 3 C-rations were consumed, adequate for soldiers engaged in moderate physical activity. The variety was limited, but sufficient to prevent nutritional deficiencies during extended periods when fresh foods weren't available. The palatability was adequate. Soldiers complained about C-rations constantly, but they ate them, which was the critical requirement. The production scale. The transition from laboratory development to mass production happened with remarkable speed, driven by military urgency. By late 1942, multiple American factories were producing C-rations using vacuum sealing techniques that had started in Dorothy Patterson's kitchen 18 months earlier. The production scale was staggering. By 1943, American factories were producing approximately 200 million C-rations annually, enough to provide 3 meals daily for approximately 180,000 troops for an entire year. By 1944, as American forces in Europe expanded, production reached approximately 500 million C-rations annually. By war's end in 1945, cumulative production exceeded 2 billion individual C-rations, representing approximately 6 billion meals that could be stored and transported without refrigeration. The economic impact was substantial. Each C-ration cost approximately 40 cents to produce in 1944, cheap enough for military budgets while providing sufficient profit margins to justify factory investment. The reduced spoilage rates meant that shipping capacity went toward feeding soldiers rather than transporting food that would be destroyed. The elimination of refrigeration requirements freed electrical capacity and equipment for other uses. The employment impact was significant. C-ration production factories employed approximately 50,000 workers by 1944, predominantly women who'd taken industrial jobs when men went to war. The factories operated 3 shifts daily, producing rations around the clock to meet military demand. The work was repetitive but essential, and workers understood their production was feeding soldiers fighting overseas. The European distribution. C-rations became backbone of U.S. Army logistics in Europe, following the Normandy invasion. The rations could be distributed directly to combat units without requiring field kitchens or cooking facilities. Soldiers could eat cold or heat meals over small fires. The packaging was durable enough to survive being carried in packs, stored in muddy foxholes, or left in vehicles during combat. The logistical advantages were transformative. Prior to C-rations, feeding troops in combat zones required establishing field kitchens, transporting cooking equipment, maintaining supply chains for perishable ingredients, and dedicating personnel to food preparation. C-rations eliminated most of those requirements. Combat units could operate independently for days or weeks with C-rations in their packs, reducing their dependence on supply lines and increasing their tactical flexibility. The scale of C-ration distribution across Europe was documented in quartermaster reports. During the 6 months following D-Day, from June through December 1944, American forces in Europe consumed approximately 400 million C-rations, an average of approximately 2.2 million rations daily. At the peak of European operations in early 1945, when American forces numbered approximately 3 million troops, daily C-ration distribution reached approximately 4 to 5 million units. The massive distribution was possible because C-rations could be stockpiled near front lines without requiring refrigeration or special storage. The soldier experience. For American soldiers in Europe, C-rations became a familiar part of combat existence. The rations weren't beloved. Soldiers complained about limited variety, unappetizing appearance, and monotony of eating the same meals repeatedly. But the rations were reliable, adequate, and always available when hunger demanded food, regardless of tactical situation. The common soldier's perspective on C-rations mixed grudging acceptance with creative adaptation. Soldiers developed techniques for improving C-ration meals, mixing components to create different flavor combinations, trading items with other soldiers to add variety, heating meals in creative ways to make them more palatable. The adaptations demonstrated that while C-rations weren't gourmet dining, they provided adequate foundation that soldiers could work with. Private James Walsh, who fought across France and Germany with the 1st Infantry Division, described his relationship with C-rations in letters home. "The food isn't great, but it's food, and that matters when you're cold and hungry and haven't seen a hot meal in days. I've eaten C-rations for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for weeks straight. Gets old quick. But it beats being hungry, and it beats the alternative of not having any food at all. At least I know I'll eat today, and tomorrow, and the day after. Can't say that about a lot of things in this war." The psychological impact of reliable food availability shouldn't be underestimated. Soldiers who knew they'd eat adequately regardless of tactical situation could focus mental energy on combat operations rather than worrying about hunger. The certainty that C-rations would be available, that food was one variable that was solved, provided stability in an environment where almost nothing else was certain. The comparative advantage. The C-ration system gave American forces significant logistical advantage over enemy forces whose supply systems were less sophisticated and less reliable. German forces by 1944 were experiencing chronic food shortages that weakened combat effectiveness. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific operated on inadequate rations that left troops malnourished. American soldiers complained about C-rations but ate adequately, while many enemy soldiers were genuinely hungry. The German military food system in 1944-45 was collapsing under strain of resource shortages and disrupted supply lines. German soldiers increasingly relied on foraging, captured supplies, and inadequate field rations that provided less than minimum caloric requirements. The deteriorating nutrition contributed to declining combat effectiveness, increased disease rates, and poor morale. German prisoners of war consistently cited hunger as major factor in their willingness to surrender. The contrast wasn't lost on American soldiers who captured German positions and found evidence of food deprivation. Abandoned German positions often contained partially eaten food scraps that suggested desperation. Captured German soldiers were typically hungry and grateful for American rations. The food disparity represented broader resource advantage that allowed American forces to maintain fighting strength, while enemy forces weakened from multiple deprivations, including inadequate nutrition. The hidden contributor. Dorothy Patterson never sought recognition for her contribution to military food systems. She continued living in Springfield, preserving vegetables in her kitchen, listening to radio reports about American advances in Europe. She knew her vacuum sealing techniques had been adapted for military use. The Quartermaster Institute had kept her informed about developments, but she didn't discuss it publicly and didn't expect acknowledgement. The War Department offered her modest consulting fees for her technical assistance, which she accepted but didn't consider significant. She viewed her contribution as ordinary civic duty, sharing knowledge that might help soldiers, rather than as remarkable achievement deserving special recognition. When neighbors asked what she'd been doing during the war, she'd mention helping with some food preservation research, but didn't elaborate on the scale or impact. The anonymity was typical of countless home front contributions that enabled military success without generating headlines or recognition. Women who worked in factories producing war materials, farmers who grew food under rationing constraints, scientists who solved technical problems in obscure laboratories, engineers who improved manufacturing processes, all contributed essentially to victory without expectation of fame or lasting acknowledgement. The Institute scientists who'd worked with Patterson understood her contribution's significance. Dr. Robert Chen, who'd initially contacted her, later said, "Dorothy Patterson gave us the key insight that unlocked solutions we'd been struggling with for months. Her practical knowledge from decades of home food preservation provided foundation for techniques that fed millions. She should be remembered as someone whose kitchen wisdom became military necessity, but she'd probably be embarrassed by the attention." The mathematics of impact. The cumulative impact of improved food preservation on military operations was measurable and significant. The reduction in spoilage rates from approximately 30 to 40% for traditional supplies to approximately 3 to 5% for vacuum-sealed rations represented massive efficiency improvement that enhanced military capability. The specific measurements were documented in quartermaster reports. During 1944, the peak year of European operations, American forces overseas consumed approximately 500 million C-rations, containing approximately 1.5 billion meals. At traditional spoilage rates of 30 to 40%, maintaining that consumption level would have required shipping approximately 650–700 million rations to account for waste. The improved preservation meant that approximately 150 to 200 million fewer rations needed to be produced and shipped, a savings of roughly 30% in production and shipping capacity. The shipping capacity freed by reduced spoilage translated directly to enhanced military capability. Each cargo ship that didn't need to carry extra rations to account for spoilage could carry additional ammunition, equipment, or supplies. Across the thousands of cargo voyages that sustained American forces in Europe, the cumulative capacity gain was equivalent to hundreds of additional ship voyages. The preservation improvements literally expanded logistical capacity without building additional ships or ports. The cost savings were substantial. At approximately 40 cents per C-ration, the 150–200 million rations saved annually through improved preservation represented approximately $60–80 million in reduced production costs. Significant savings, even in context of total war expenditure measured in hundreds of billions. The enduring lesson, the story of how kitchen preservation trick ended up feeding the U.S. Army in Europe documented that military success depends as much on solving mundane logistical problems as on tactical brilliance or technological superiority. The preservation techniques that allowed food to survive transport and storage without spoiling weren't dramatic innovations. They were practical applications of knowledge that had existed for generations but hadn't been systematically applied to military challenges. The lesson was that expertise exists throughout society in unexpected places, that practical knowledge from civilian contexts can solve military problems, that sometimes the most valuable contributions come from people who aren't military specialists but who understand fundamental principles that military planners have overlooked. Dorothy Patterson's contribution represented that principle in its purest form. She wasn't scientist, engineer, or military logistics expert. She was housewife who knew how to preserve food because she'd been doing it for 30 years. When military faced food preservation crisis, her practical knowledge provided solutions that specialists had been struggling to develop. The kitchen trick that kept her green beans fresh became foundation for feeding millions of soldiers thousands of miles from home. The vacuum-sealed rations that American soldiers ate in foxholes across Europe, that sustained them during sustained operations, that freed logistical capacity for other uses, that gave them advantage over hungry enemies, all traced lineage back to Springfield Kitchen, where Housewife had noticed that properly sealed jars kept food fresh indefinitely. The connection between kitchen and battlefield demonstrated that wars are won not just by generals and soldiers, but by ordinary people whose practical knowledge becomes military necessity when someone has wisdom to recognize its value and adapt it for new purposes. The billions of meals that C-rations provided, the reduced spoilage that freed shipping capacity, the logistical advantages that enhanced military effectiveness, all emerged from decision by one housewife to write a letter suggesting that the Army try vacuum-sealing food the way she preserved vegetables at home. And in that suggestion, in that willingness to share practical knowledge for larger purpose, lay the unglamorous but essential contribution that helped feed an army and win a war.